So, with how disliked Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are as presidential candidates, and with the level of enthusiasm you see Jill Stein garnering on social media, you would think that she would at least be able to garner more than 2% in public opinion polls, but unfortunately, she's polling at just that. 2%. So the question is, what the hell is going on? And it may come down to polling methodology that is significantly underestimating the level of support Jill Stein has. Inquisitor explains, guessing which poll respondents will actually show up on election day has always been something of an informed guess for pollsters, and they don't sound terribly confident this year compared to the past. These methods, which have been around for so long, may be losing some of their accuracy because circumstances have changed, Scott Keeter, a senior survey advisor at Pew Research, told The Atlantic. Whether there has been a change in our politics in just the last 2 years that makes all of this less accurate is really impossible to answer at this point. And those likely voter models, the ones that are used to show Jill Stein's low support, are generally weighted to expect fewer young and first-time voters. That happens to make up a large share of the Green Party's base, so a model that fails to take these voters into account will have Jill Stein underperforming. So basically, what's going on is a large proportion of the Green Party's support comes from millennial voters, and our demographic, I think we can all admit, is less reliable when it comes to whether or not they're going to show up to vote. And each year, the rate at which we show up to vote is declining. So it's really difficult to accurately gauge how many millennials will show up, especially in an election year like this, where we have two historically disliked candidates in Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. So this is the same thing that impacted Bernie Sanders as well, because they tried to formulate polls that would be weighted against younger people because that's kind of what they're anticipating happening. I don't necessarily think that they have this plan to hide support for Jill Stein supporters. And look, we do know that certain polls do disproportionately and intentionally create bias against people like Jill Stein and Gary Johnson because of the way in which they phrase the questions. And there's a separate video of that I will put a link to in the description box. But when it comes to just trying to guess how many younger voters will come out, pollsters really try to take this into account, and in the end, it ends up really hurting the polling numbers for people like Jill Stein and Gary Johnson as well. Now, they also explain that as the presidential race tightens and voters grow more afraid of the prospect of their most hated candidate winning, they tend to, quote, come home. And when they come home, they end up voting for one of the two major candidates. So this indicates that we probably won't see Jill Stein and Gary Johnson's poll numbers rise anytime soon, especially as it gets closer and closer to the election, because less people will be inclined to take a risk and vote third party. So the problem is that we don't necessarily know how much support Jill Stein is actually getting, and there's really no way to measure this that would really tell us how much support she's getting, because you can look at anecdotal evidence and see just how enthusiastic people are on Facebook and Twitter, but in actuality, trying to figure out how enthusiastic people are and how that's going to translate into her voting numbers and how many people will come out to vote for her are two very different things that are really difficult to determine. So I don't necessarily blame pollsters for this because, admittedly, look, our demographic is very difficult to track. We rarely turn out for midterm elections, and our track record of turning out to vote during presidential elections, like I said, it's been declining. So this is something that is a problem. So I think that the only way that we could really rectify this problem and help third-party candidates is if us millennials get out and vote, because if we're a reliable voting demographic and we come out to vote at every single election, then they won't weight these polls against us. And third-party candidates who we are more likely to support than other voting demographics, well, they're actually going to have a chance to get into debates. And if they get into debates, well, then that will propel them to the national stage and give them a much higher chance of actually winning. Now, it comes down to electoral reform as well, not just debates. We need electoral reform. It's very difficult for third-party candidates to win in these winner-take-all majoritarian systems like ours, but we can at least give them a chance and improve their odds if we actually reliably show up to vote. But the frustrating thing is that that's not going to happen overnight. It has to happen over multiple election cycles, and with the rate that things are going, even if we all come out in large numbers to vote during this election, well, that's not going to change much for the next election cycle because they can look at this as an anomaly. So it's really, really tricky. And overall, it's just frustrating that they don't really have a way to predict how many millennials will actually get out and vote for the candidate they say they're supporting. Now, think about how well this reflects on Jill Stein's character, because she really tries to tailor her policies to millennial voters because they come out to support her in larger numbers than older demographics. So she could try to move further to the right and pander more to older voters and whatnot, but she's not doing that. She's just being genuine and stating what policy she wants to implement, and she's being forward-thinking and trying to help out millennials because we're the ones who, when we're older, we're going to have to deal with the consequences of climate change. We have no idea what the economy will look like by then, so I think that it's really admirable for third-party candidates to remain consistent in spite of this problem that pollsters have in trying to track millennials. And look, I'm not going to completely strip blame away from pollsters because they do phrase questions in a way that hurts third-party candidates. So, I mean, rather than asking who they support more, they usually ask who they're going to vote for. And who they like or support more is a very different question than who they're actually going to vote for. So even though they may like Jill Stein more politically, they might say they're going to vote for Hillary Clinton to defeat Donald Trump. So there are ways in which these polls are biased against third-party candidates. But in this way, I don't necessarily think it is the pollsters' fault for hurting third-party candidates. I think this is just an inadvertent consequence of trying to gauge how much support a candidate is going to receive if a large proportion of their voting base doesn't always come out to vote. So it's just a really tricky thing. It is hurting Jill Stein, unfortunately.